And we have to realize that the most precious idea that supports the arts, creative expression, that supports theology, personal salvation, that supports psychology, the inner person as an individual. Our most cherished myth is in individuality, the free choosing individual person. If we were to think about how we're dominated by the myth of individualism and how a great deal of our suffering comes from that, of being abandoned and unrelated, and how the culture, the psychological culture, aims so strongly at relationship. Why is that such a big word? In philosophy, there are two kinds of relations. One is what they call internal relations and external relations. In external relations, you have two things, and then they have to be related. And internal relations are that they are inherently related in some way. So our notion of individualism sets up always external relations between things that are inherently separated. So you've got to have group psychology, you have to have family systems, you have to have relatedness as the main aim, because the fundamental myth is of individual people who are not related. Now suppose you drop the myth of individualism, then all these problems of relationship and all that would change somehow. The sense of self that now we live with is that you were born with an innate organizing principle that reflects something transcendent. The transcendent God, let's say. It's the God within. Now suppose the self were no longer imagined in that way, but were imagined not as the interiorization of the transcendent God, but were the interiorization of community. That the self were the interiorization of community. Then retreating to your room to meditate would be farther from the self than going out and having a drink with somebody. The disciplines we now use for finding the self are generally retreat from others because of the myth of individualism. And I'm suggesting that if the notion of self changed, then the way of finding self would be perhaps more exterior. Just hang on to this idea of where you would go, what you would do if the myth of individualism and the idea of self were to change from interiorization of the transcendent God to interiorization of the community. Of community, whatever community suggests. Could be community with the world, rocks, strawberries, and so on. Our myth of individualism supports our theology of personal salvation, our notion of artistic creation. We think there's an individual artist who alone creates, supports our notions of therapy. Now, if the basic notion of self shifts, then an awful lot of our notion of salvation shifts, of art shifts, and so on. It's just to imagine a transformation of what happens if we think of the self differently. And I think it's a very important idea.